My name is Bo Kilgore, and this is the Battle Tested Podcast. The challenging thing is, this stuff doesn't come naturally to us, right? So you made the point that there's some people we can look at and say, man, they've got it all together. They've got it figured out. They're super successful. They're healthy. They seem to have favor wherever they go.
Right.
And to your point, we don't always see the inner workings of that. So it can be almost, it's kind of deceitful that you think some people just come so naturally for, but for me, I know I've got all these problems. I didn't have the opportunity,
Right.
or I just, life didn't go my way. What about having that mindset of it's kind of a victim mindset where you just say, well, works out for other people, doesn't necessarily work out for me. Life, it wasn't in the cards for me. Right.
Yeah. Well, one thing I say, I actually preached a sermon. I mentioned this, and it was kind of controversial. Is like I push back against the idea that you can be anything that you want to be. Like, I don't believe you can be anything that you want to be. Like, there's limitations. I could never be an NBA player, right? Like, there's, we were talking earlier, I run marathons. You probably could never be a good marathoner.
No, I will happily admit that. I'll leave the marathon running to you. Yeah.
So you can't be anything you want to be, but you can be the very best of however God has designed you to be, or whatever God's created you to be or wired you to be.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes we put so much stress on ourselves by comparing ourselves to other people's skill sets, giftings. Mm-hmm. Man, you mentioned we're both pastors. Pastors, our scope is so broad of like things that we have to be good at. Like, we need to be great communicators. We need to be like great leaders. We have to be visionaries. We've got to be good at member care. We've got to be counseling. We have to have the right word in the right season. And so I can look at other guys who are gifted in areas that I struggle in. Like, man, I wish I could be more like that.
Right.
But the truth is, I'm never going to be all those things to the nth degree.
Mm-hmm.
But what I can do is focus on the areas where I am gifted and get the very most out of those. And if we would stop trying to be good at everything and really focus on, like, this is what God's called me to do,
right? And
I'm gonna get every ounce of goodness out of this thing,
right?
And focus that energy towards those things. They'll be much more effective, and it'll come more natural to us because we're not trying to do everything.
Right. No, I think that's great. And at the same time, like, you have certain giftings, whether it's intellectually or naturally, that you recognize as strengths that you can continue to build and get stronger with those things. But then I think, going back to the way of the warrior, these characteristics that a warrior would display, I would say there's also a set of values that each and every one of us could adopt and become better at. Not necessarily that, like, when it comes to our integrity.
Sure.
It's not necessarily true that somebody could be gifted in the area of integrity. Well, they just were born with integrity, and I'll never be able to achieve that. Or, well, this person was just born with courage, or this person was born with discipline. No, there's these intangible qualities, right? It's these intangible qualities that sets the warrior class apart that any of us can have, but it doesn't come naturally to us. Like, we have to work towards these things. You have to build discipline in your mind. You have to build discipline in your body. You have to build discipline in your time management and your finances. Even learning how to overcome doubt, learning how to manage finances or whatever it is. There's certain attributes here, and the things that we've listed, we're talking about courage, resilience, honor, wisdom, and what you and I are going to be diving into today is a subject that I think you're perfect to speak to, and that is having this mindset or an openness to be a lifelong learner, being a lifelong student of what exactly? I think life. I think just, whatever your vocation is, whatever your interests are, just having the intentionality to want to learn and increase in knowledge and increase in wisdom. And you're someone who's had quite the journey in higher education and learning. And part of that has been helping me even whenever I went through DLI.
Mm-hmm.
You were a professor of mine. You were one of the people that was helping me on my journey of higher education. But what would you say to that, incorporating that mindset into the way of the warrior, and being a lifelong learner, that approach to life?
Yeah, there's such value in just being curious,
Yeah.
like just wanting to know more about. Like I read broadly because I just want to know more, and I'm at my best whenever my mind is engaged. So I have been. I just finished my Ph.D. May of this year, so Ph.D. in New Testament, and the fact is I'm probably going to teach some adjunct courses in the next few months, but my job did not depend on that. Like I'm not transitioning
Right.
from pastoring to academia, so I didn't even really have to do it.
Right.
Like, there's no tangible. None of my.
It's not like you hit a ceiling in pay or where you would be promoted to without
Right.
it, right?
Right. It wasn't like my like my lead pastor wasn't like, hey, I'm gonna double your salary now that you're like, there was no tangible benefit.
Right.
But I think for me it was something I went to earlier. Is I want to get every ounce out of what God has given me.
Yeah.
And I know that He's gifted me academically, intellectually. I've often said that I don't know that I'm like genuinely have of a superior intellect. Like I've met some really, really smart people.
It's very humble of you to say that.
but I really feel like a lot of it has just been curiosity
Yeah.
and dedication and work and the ability to remain focused and disciplined, balance a lot of things on my plate in order to accomplish it. But I just needed to know. My start in ministry really came from just needing to know.
Need to know the big questions you had.
I fought against being my call into ministry.
Yeah.
Mostly because there was just things I didn't understand.
Yeah.
Things I heard preached that made absolutely no sense to me.
Yeah.
And so I felt like I just want to know for myself, and it's taken me on this really, really long journey.
And if you hadn't had that mindset and that approach to it, these big questions you had could have stumped you or caused you to take a completely different direction with your life, right?
Sure.
I mean, if you didn't have this approach to those big questions of I'm gonna learn and figure it out, if you would have just even gone with the flow, if you would have just accepted, well, this is what everybody around me believes, and this is what I'm being taught, so I'm gonna go with it. I don't know if you would be where you're at.
Yeah, and what's great about that is that I don't know that I've found a whole lot of answers. Like, I'm still have a lot of questions, but what it allowed me to see, though, was that there were people who had thought seriously about these things and came to conclusions that supported faith.
Yeah.
Which gives you a little bit of confidence, like okay, I know what I know, and now I'm going to make a faith decision to believe it.
That's good.
And there's something, there are some people who have found Christ or found God, primarily through an intellectual endeavor. C.S. Lewis is one, someone who just it was all an intellectual thing, and I think for me it was more. I just needed to see that these didn't have to be barriers.
Right.
And then once I got there, I'm able to take the faith step and say, okay, well, this is what I believe. And I know some people don't believe it, but it's what I believe. And there's supporting evidence that I'm aware of that supports that faith decision. But yeah, it was very much a journey of like, I just want to know. And now I'm done with my degree, and I'm probably going to, I want to do some writing. But I just do like a lot of reading.
Yeah.
I stay on top of my Greek, not because I have an exam, but because I just feel better whenever my mind is engaged.
There's also a side of this mentality of being a lifelong learner that has nothing to do with formal education. Right. It's more of a learning the practical things that we deal with, or whether it's on your job, but also learning some hard lessons along the way, learning emotional intelligence, perhaps. I think being a lifelong learner is not just about, whatever kind of credential you can get. I think it's honestly just a mindset and a way of living that you are open to learning in any setting or situation that you're in. Mm-hmm. So there's things that would hold you back from that. I'll tell you what held me back from it personally. Some of the things that held me back was complacency. There were times in my life where I just settled for where I was at. Mm-hmm. Before I got into ministry, I worked in real estate. I worked in mill work, and of course, I spent 5 years in the Marine Corps. And I think back to certain times, even my time in the service, where I recognized there were things I could have done to set myself apart a little more, or succeed. Maybe have different responsibilities, or get promoted faster, or just learn my job better. But because of complacency, where I was like, I know enough, or I'm content right here. Man, getting to that next level would be a lot of work. I would have to, I'd have to cut this out. I'd have to not go drinking with my buddies, and I'd have to stop living this way if I wanted to get to that next level. And so it's been a long journey for me, just understanding that if I'm going to be a lifelong learner, I have to battle that complacency in my life of just kind of being satisfied. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily because I want to reach a new position or salary level or anything like that, but just am I being aware enough of things I should know? Or am I aware of certain conversations that I should be part of as a pastor? What's happening culturally that I'm maybe tuning out right now? If I'm wrestling with a theological question, I could just say, you know what? Nobody in my church is going to ask me any of these questions about this very complex theological issue. So am I satisfied not knowing, or should I explore that for myself? So complacency's held me back. Pride has also held me back, especially when I was younger. I think I had this idea that I knew what was best for me, or not necessarily that I was the smartest person, but that I just adopted this I can make my own decisions kind of mentality. And I think it prohibited me from maybe having some great mentors or people teaching me some things. So what would you say, speaking to that, how there were things in your world that weren't necessarily about the formal education you received, but more the practical leading, working, operating? I mean, what's your approach like to that side of learning?
Oh, that's great. So the thing that would hold me back from learning things I need to learn is perfectionism, as I said earlier. So it's easy for me to say, well, I'm never going to be good at that, so I don't care. Yeah. I don't want to know about that. I don't need to get better at that, because that's not. Yeah. And if I can't be excellent at it, I don't want to be that at all. And also, I think a little bit of snobbery is a good word. Where it's like sometimes there are things that I need to know, but I'm like, you know what, I'm kind of above that. I'm smart people don't need to learn how to do that, right? And so a lot of practical things that I've learned about, like actually leading a church, like how to manage a staff, leadership and management things. I've always thought, that's for people who aren't really smart enough to do theology and Bible.
You can hire somebody.
They become leadership experts, right?
Yeah.
And so there's been part of me, and I'm just being facetious, because I really had to humble myself to go, no, actually, that it's a whole skill set that I have to learn.
And you don't learn that without being hands-on with it.
Right. So in seminary, to get a master's of divinity, you need Bible classes, theology classes, and practical ministry classes. I took the bare minimum practical ministry, which is the opposite of what everyone else did, because they were the easiest classes to get an A in. Yeah. And so I guess I just had this attitude as we have the same degree, but I was taking Greek, and you were taking leading in a cross-cultural context, and like some kind of and but it really did hold me back, though, because there were just things that I realized that my church people, they didn't really care how smart I was. Right?
I don't care what the Greek word is.
They didn't really care. Whenever there was some kind of crisis or we weren't doing well. Yeah. Me being the smartest guy in the room didn't really help them that much of that. And so I really did have to I need to learn how to manage a team. I need to learn how to clearly communicate a vision and to get people on board.
Yeah.
I need to learn how to deal with difficult people rather than just hopefully that
They go away.
they'll go away. Yeah, exactly.
They'll feel called to go to another church.
Right. Like they're so holy. Like, you know.
I pray that my difficult people go to your church, that because I just trust that you'd be able to help them out. So,
well, unfortunately, we live like an hour. We're in the same city and we live an hour apart. So that's.
I also don't have difficult people.
Right.
Let me just say.
So there were a lot of things that I had to. I think pride's probably the good thing. It's like I really had to humble myself and go. I need to know more about these things that I'm not naturally good at, and probably the pride and the perfectionism, they work together, because there was something in me that would always say, well, I'm never going to be a good pastor. Like I can be a good preacher, I can be a good educator, and I'll pastor because I was asked to, but I'm never going to be good at that. Because like I'm an introvert, and the leadership stuff's like not really my like I don't want to sit around and listen to leadership podcasts.
Right.
Like whenever I wake up in the morning, I'm not like, oh, I wonder what Craig Rochele's doing right now. Like, and he's great. It's great content. I'm not.
Yeah. You wonder what he's doing. He's locked in. Whatever he's doing, he's locked in. Yeah.
But it's not my natural.
Right.
My natural thing is like that isn't if I'm going to put a podcast on the car.
Yeah.
It's gonna be a Bible, a theology podcast, right? But what I had to do is humble myself to go, but okay, I really need to listen to the Craig Rochelle leadership podcast, because I actually have a lot of room to grow in those areas, and I can't excuse my weaknesses.
Yeah,
I have to grow with what God's entrusted me to do. I really do have to grow in my leadership.
So you're intentional with the way you balance, like obviously the formal education that you're passionate about, and then the informal things that you recognize, I need to know these things. You got to find that balance.
Right. In order to do, you have to do what you have to do the things that you want to do.
That's good.
And so there are things that, because of what I want to do, preaching, leading, teaching, there are some parts of that, like pastoral counseling, not my thing.
Yeah.
Like as far as what I know some pastors and I envy them. I've got friends who, they love to get in the weeds and help people. And I love to help people. But I feel so inadequate. Yeah. In those situations.
Well, I think, I'm an introvert as well. And not that I can't be extroverted, but it takes me a while to recharge or charge up for those moments. And so with pastoring, it can be, that can be a challenge, is just the dynamic of being involved with people, which it's not that I hate it or anything like that. It's just a different approach for me. But then I get around people like my friend Phil Daigle, and it's like he lives for the people. He lives for the crowd and the conversations.
I get tired watching Phil.
He is, dude. It's incredible. And I worked with him for a while, but so it's funny to see how someone, well, not that we're polar opposite, but there were certain things that I was good at, and I felt like, okay, these are very important. And then I would watch Phil and the way he would connect with people, and I'd be like, that's got to be exhausting. But it's what fueled him, and the way that I guess when you have the right team assembled, people can bring their strengths in. But yeah, somebody like Phil, where he can just go around and connect with people like that, I have to learn that. And I'm still not great at it. It's an intentionality thing, I think, is I can get locked in on my tasks, or I can just get to a point where I feel depleted and I kind of hide away. But I think if you're aware of those deficiencies, for lack of a better word, if you're aware of those deficiencies in your leadership or in your skill set, you have to be intentional about building those or becoming better with those things. So striking a balance, for me, I love podcasts. I listen to leadership podcasts, and I listen to podcasts where it's just more cultural and to kind of give me an awareness of what's going on in the world. I do read a lot, but I have to also find a balance between reading theology books, leadership books, and then like reading Lord of the Rings if I want to, which you need to do that.
I'm going to read Lord of the Rings.
But finding that way to I guess one thing I've struggled with before is getting burnt out, because I feel like, okay, I've got to grow in this area, or I've got to learn these things, or I've got to get this credential or whatever, and just overloading my schedule, overloading even my capacity. And like I said, I've had semesters where I've just dropped out because I wasn't prepared for the work that I set myself up for. And, I'm a husband and I'm a father, and there's things about those roles that I need to improve on or learn about and become better with. And so I think having the appropriate balance of
that's what I am
learning.
A perfect father and husband all the time.
I didn't want to bring it up because I knew it was just going to make me look bad.
But yeah, if you're not good at that, you probably should get better.
Please don't talk to my wife. Don't have a conversation.
Before we move on, though, you mentioned like reading sci-fi. I think that's really important too. Is that Eugene Peterson in his book, The Contemplative Pastor, he actually has a chapter on pastors as poets, and the idea though is like good fiction, whether poetry or prose, what it does in you creatively. There's this intangible benefit.
Yeah.
So I think when we talk about lifelong learning, we cannot turn this into something uber practical all the time. Well, like I'm learning for this objective. Like I'm reading a biography of C.S. Lewis right now.
Mm-hmm.
I probably won't preach it, teach it, but it's still shaping me, informing me, so that I'm a better preacher and teacher, because it's just the process of reading, interpreting good books. It makes you better in every area of life.
Right.
And I think that would be one thing that I would push back against in some of our like leadership culture today, is a lot of times like reading always has to have an agenda, or a podcast has to have like, I'm going to read this so I can get better at that.
Yeah.
And there's a place for that, but sometimes you just need to read because like it forms you.
I can't tell you how many times I want to incorporate into my story or into my sermon, incorporate into my Sunday sermons, Darth Vader, or in Lord of the Rings, there's this character. His name's Theoden, and he's my favorite character in the whole story. And I tell people that sometimes they're like, Theoden, because if you ever watch the movies or read the book, his story begins when you're introduced to him. It's not that great. Like he's messed up. Spoiler alert, he's being influenced by the enemy, and he's got the greatest character arc in the whole story, I think, because he has this moment where it's an opportunity as king. He can rise to the occasion and lead his people, but he kind of withdraws. He doesn't meet that moment. But at the very end, his story. I'm gonna let you read it because it's one of those stories I think that will shape you. But it resonates with me so much because I've been a guy who didn't always get it right. I've been a guy that had a lot of issues in my past, made a lot of wrong choices, bad decisions. I'm a guy that's failed a lot. I'm a guy that's failed people a lot. But I'm hoping that I can have a character arc like this guy, Theoden, in the story where, when it really matters the most, my life will wind up making a difference in a positive way. Right. And I preached a message one time at a young adult service for college age people, and I wore a t-shirt with Darth Vader on it. And I said, look, my story is like Darth Vader. Like I grew up learning the way, and Anakin, of course, he grew up being trained as a Jedi, and then he fell away, and he lived, he did despicable things. He lived this terrible life, evil life, but the end of his story is redemption. And so I think you're right. Honestly, I've gotten in that mindset where I'm like, everything I have to read has to make me better, and it's not life-giving to me. Right. But if I sit down and read Dune, or if I sit down and I can read Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or whatever, if I sit down and read these stories, it like awakens. I don't want to call it like a creative side, but I'm not sure what to call it. It awakens something in my spirit. I think that it gives me more creativity, it gives me more energy, it gives me more passion. And, I think of King David. King David was a warrior. This dude was fighting giants, and he was leading the mighty men. He's waging war, and he's fighting battles. He's also a musician.
A poet.
And he's a poet.
Yeah.
And I think that's a perfect picture of, I don't want to be a one-dimensional guy.
Right. And God made himself known through story.
Yeah.
Like he didn't give us like a list of edicts and rules, and we are revealed to the nature of God through narratives. And so I think that's why we are drawn to good literature or to good stories, because that's how God's wired us. We are part of a story. We have a story. And
that's good. So what are you reading right now? You're reading a biography on C.S. Lewis.
Biography of C.S. Lewis. because I just finished my dissertation, so I'm really enjoying reading whatever I want. So I've been reading biographies. The late Tim Keller was very influential on my life, so I've picked up a biography of him that's next on my to-do list.
Cool.
The Song of Achilles was the last book that I read. Then Surprised by Joy by C.S. Lewis as well.
That's good.
So C.S. Lewis and Tim Keller are two really influential thought leaders, and so because I was so focused on my dissertation, I've really enjoyed backing up and maybe reading some of my classes again.
That's great.
John Mark Comer, he wrote this book about hurry, like the sin of hurry. I forget the exact title, slips my mind right now, but it's
the sin of hurrying.
Yeah,
I think, and that's a good point, because think about, I kind of have. I mentioned my struggles, I guess, with having this mentality of lifelong learning. One thing we haven't talked about, though, is just how quickly things are changing. I mean, think of how much access we have to information nowadays compared to when we were growing up. But then just, the method of how we access that information, and the world is changing at a pace that feels like it's hard to keep up. Like I'm a millennial. How old are you? 37?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're around the same age, millennial age, but that in our age bracket of the millennial generation, things change so fast. I grew up going outside, riding bikes, there was no smartphones or social media, right? But then, like, in the matter of just some moments, it felt like for me, it was when I was like 16 to 20, like this, the influx of the smartphone, all these different devices, then all these social media platforms just kind of taking the scene. And it even feels hard for me to sometimes keep up with how fast technology and information is moving. And so it is easy to, I guess, fit into or sit yourself down into this comfortable space where, you watch the shows you want to watch, you go to work, you do your routine, and then you come home and you just kind of numb yourself with the pleasurable information or entertainment that you can find. Mm-hmm. But it takes some intentionality of maybe reading a book or exploring these other forums of information, like podcasts that are going to challenge you and grow you. So has that ever been an issue with you, where you kind of tended to drift towards, information that serves no purpose to you, or entertainment that wouldn't serve any purpose, and you kind of get trapped in those cycles of you're not growing, but you're comfortable?
Yeah, that's great. And even though I'm with how I'm wired a little more academically, there've still been seasons where maybe I get like so overwhelmed. Like when I was writing my dissertation, I would get so overwhelmed with a project that the easiest thing to do was just to like watch Netflix all night, because it was just such an overwhelming task. One thing that I've done, and I have the luxury of a pretty flexible schedule. Like I get to make my own schedule. I try to put in like reading as part of my work day. Like there's time in my office time where I've got an hour set aside to read, because I do feel like it's very important to what I do. Yeah. Whether or not there's a practical objective for doing it. So I think that was really important to just make the time for it, to put it part of your rhythm and part of your routine. Yeah. But yes, we do live in an age of distraction. Yeah. We do live in an age of like so many possibilities, and it's so easy to just, think about some of these guys that lived before us. You look at like guys like John Calvin or Wesley, and the amount of writing they did, their proficiency in languages, and you start going, well, how can one person write that much and be that knowledgeable on that many different topics?
They didn't have Call of Duty.
They didn't have Call of Duty, right? They didn't have Netflix. Yeah. They didn't have, and so there's room. We need all of that. I believe that good film and good movies and good shows are artistic gift. They're common graces. So I'm all for it. But the problem is like we're not meant to binge 4 hours. But how easy is it to do that, because we're so so overwhelmed and tired. So you really do have to find some kind of rules around. That's where discipline comes in.
Yeah.
Some kind of rules around technology. Like I'm only going to watch this much TV. I'm going to put my phone away. In the mornings,
You sound like my wife.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave it on the charger, and until I've done some reading and some prayer and some exercise, I'm not getting sucked into the Twitter vortex like the moment that I wake up.
It's X now.
The X the X vortex is much better. Yeah, and X is actually a great example. Like you can get great educational information. Like you can curate who you follow, and you can know everything about all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
That was one thing that the biography of Tim Keller talked about. Like whenever he was alive, it was Twitter still, but he had curated his follows where he loved it because he was getting access to all kinds of theology and culture and biblical studies. But then it can also just be the biggest time suck, the worst of humanity, the worst opinions that anyone could like.
Yeah.
And then you click it and you read the comments or the replies, and it's like you just really have no hope for the world after going down that hole. But you've got to find a way to curate who you're following, how you're using this stuff. And look, I'm not a monk, right? So there's a space for after a long day scrolling through social media mindlessly for 20 or 30 minutes.
Of course.
Fine. But overall, you've got to find rules around your technology.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if you just kind of like read whenever you want to, I've recently preached a sermon about drifting, and I was talking about spiritually, but I think this will also be intellectually. Yeah. Drifting is always downstream. Like you if you just don't have a plan, it always gets worse. Yep. If you don't tend to your flower bed outside, you're not going to walk out one day and go, wow, look. Yeah. Look at these roses. Yeah. Like you're gonna look at these weeds, right? If you just let your physical health drift, like you're like, oh, I got a 6-pack. How did that happen? That doesn't. Things don't get better unless you're intentional.
Well, I think that's with anything. Starting out this conversation, I said certain characteristics we're talking about, they don't come naturally. Naturally, what is it that happens for us is we drift towards sin. We drift towards unhealthy lifestyle. We drift towards complacency and comfort. Right. We drift towards what's easy, what's safe. And so, I think unless you're intentional and you have some discipline, you're always going to drift in a way that's maybe a little unhealthy or negative for you. Right. So to start wrapping this up, what I'd like to do is, part of this podcast, I want to help give people some practical applications, some things where they can now say, okay, I recognize I haven't had this mentality of being a lifelong learner. I want to start, incorporating certain things in my life to adopt this mindset or this lifestyle. So we've identified a challenge that I think is universal for everyone, is that we like things that are pleasurable, that are easy, that are comfortable. So we don't always like getting taken out of our comfort zone. Right. So what is the path to growth is, adopting a mindset of curiosity, of seeking out knowledge and training and skill. And so what are the practical things that you have found have helped you? I know you've mentioned a couple, like adding reading into your own schedule. Like that's a discipline where you make yourself do that. Do you have any others that might help people out, just how they can start adopting this mindset?
Yeah, read good books. Set aside that specific time for it. Make it part of your calendar. Yeah. That's the thing about you use your calendar. Don't just put your appointments on there. Actually create time. And this is time where I'm working on myself intellectually. Yeah. With all the the podcasts that are available, there really is no reason that you can't feed your mind at some point on your commute. We live in Houston, so it's 30 minutes to go anywhere, which says 30 minutes that I can learn something, on that commute. So to redeem that time, I would also say whatever your interests are, look at formal educational options. I know sometimes it's expensive, it's impractical, but the thing is you can access information anywhere. You can get information however you want, and you can find it for free. But what formal education does, at least with some formality, is it puts you on a track that you wouldn't know otherwise. So like my PhD coursework, I got a syllabus. We read a ton of books, wrote a paper, we went to a seminar and we would read our papers to each other, and then we'd leave that and I'd read a ton of books and do a post-course paper. Mm-hmm. I could have gotten the syllabus and read all the books, but there's something about submitting myself to that process that I just not only I learned things that I didn't even know I was supposed to learn. Like there are areas of, my specialty is New Testament. There's areas of New Testament I didn't even know existed. And so in our kind of anti-institutional world, I say there's still a lot of value in submitting yourself to a formal process of study. Yeah. And so if you've not earned a degree yet, maybe look at some of those options. But go online, find a course that will help you learn something, and that process is really good. So you don't know what you don't know. Yeah. And if it's just up to you to read, to figure it out, like there's so much in the world that you're never going to be exposed to. Yeah. I think for so many people listening, and this is part of my story, is it's easy to kind of settle in with where you're at, or feel like, what's the point? What's the point that my situation's hopeless, or it's too difficult, it's going to be an uphill battle. Right. But I think adopting this mindset of being a lifelong learner, it's going to help you in every aspect of your life. I think it's going to help you live your full potential, and it's going to create opportunities for you. Thank you so much for checking out this week's episode of the Battle Tested Podcast. I encourage you, if you want the extended edition of that episode, the uncut version, you can check that out by joining our Patreon. The link for that is in the description below. Make sure you follow us on Instagram at battletested.pod. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, and we'll see you next week here on the Battle Tested Podcast.